my name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation America, ORF America, which is an affiliate of the Observer Research Foundation based in New Delhi. It gives me great pleasure to have this conversation with Brad Smith, who's President and Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft, as part of our Raisina at DC discussion series to coincide with the Raisina Dialogue of 2021. Brad Smith is the co-author with Carol Ann Brown of Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age. And he joins me today to discuss his book, his experiences at Microsoft, and also some broader issues related to technology in our changing world.
Well, as you said, I've been at Microsoft for 28 years, and since 2015, I've served as president of the company. And it's a great perch, if you will, to get a very broad perspective, not just about everything that is going on inside and across Microsoft, but really across our industry and around the world. Technology is both a quintessentially global industry at this point in terms of its composition, and you see that in India, you see it in China, in Europe, in the United States, but it's also literally remaking almost every aspect of every society around the world. And as a result, it's raising issues that every government increasingly is grappling with. So we thought it made sense to write a book to make these issues more accessible to people. We get to see them from our vantage point, but we wanted other people to sort of see it through our eyes as well. So Carol Ann Brown, who I work with at Microsoft, worked with me. The two of us really wrote this book together. And it addresses all of the big issues, from cybersecurity to privacy to social media to U.S.-China relations and skilling and the like, really to hopefully give everybody a better opportunity to sort of jump into the conversation themselves.
Well, do you think, was this a book that had been in your mind for many years, or was this something that came up based, was it provoked by recent developments of some kind?
I think to some degree both. It's easy. Let me just say, it's a lot easier to think about writing a book than actually to write one. So we had been turning over in our heads the thought of writing a book, and we first started by writing some blogs together to really dive into specific issues in a shorter format. But one of the things that a book really enables an author to do is dive in more deeply. And it's just striking to me now, having written a book, the role that it does play. The way you can take a reader, inside a company, into a different location, inside an issue, and hopefully share what the people who worked on that issue were going through. And I think it still is a unique format in terms of long-form nonfiction.
Well, your book takes us inside a lot of places, but one of the places it does is a data center. And could you walk our viewers a little bit through that? What is it that a lot of users don't understand or misunderstand about the role of data in their lives? And what does the data center tell us in that sense?
Well, one of the amazing things to me is that data is so fundamental to our lives. Computing is so fundamental. And more, the computing infrastructure we're relying upon is really in these enormous data centers. And so we begin the book, in effect, by going into one. We wanted to bring to life the scale. We take the reader through, in effect, one of our big data center campuses. It has more than 20 buildings. It's in Washington State. We wanted to bring to life that it's not just a bunch of computers, just the electrical infrastructure to ensure that these computers are always on, to ensure that they not only have power from the electrical grid, but they're able to run on batteries and then generators in an instant if the power grid goes down. We wanted to bring to life the enormous security that goes into this. Not just cybersecurity, but physical security, and not just security from, say, intrusions by people, but the potential impact of fires or natural disasters. The world would not run the way it does today without all of these data centers. That's why Microsoft has built 3 sets of data centers in India. We're literally building them around the world. bringing them to every country. And much like the spread of electricity 150 or more years ago, you have to just keep investing at this sort of hyper scale in terms of capital investment and technological improvement.
But would you say that in some ways that exposes also the vulnerabilities of our sort of data-driven world?
I think to some degree it does. Now, we, in part, in recognition of those vulnerabilities, have a practice whenever we build one data center, we actually build two or really three, and we create a region. If you're a commercial customer, we may run your operations in one data center, but we'll back up your data in another. We keep these data centers geographically far apart. They're typically 150 kilometers apart or more, so that if there's an earthquake or a tsunami that impacts one part of a country, the other data center is safe and is less likely to be impacted. But I think you're right to highlight the vulnerability. I think if you just analogize to what we've seen for decades in airplanes and ships, there's a reason that there's two engines on a plane and not one. And for the same reason, we now have two or three data centers rather than a single one.
So the view that technology is a weapon and not just a tool, and that's a sort of central theme in your book, that wasn't a really fashionable one, at least in many big tech companies, until just a few years ago. What do you think changed that perception? And has that change been sufficiently reflected in corporate boardrooms and in our sort of collective innovation systems?
Well, in some ways, I think it always involves events that become tipping points. And these tipping points impact how people think about a technology more broadly. One of the things we analogized to was the way the American public opinion tipped on nuclear power when there was the 3 Mile Island accident, decades ago. And in some ways, I think that there was a similar tipping point around privacy globally. This happened for Facebook and Cambridge Analytica in 2018, but it really then swept around the world. And that was a tipping point that followed one 5 years earlier with the Snowden disclosures. And so, we look back in part at the last decade and talk about each of these inflection points, if you will. What went into them? What was the immediate aftermath? And then we put them in the broader historical context because we've seen other similar events, not just nuclear power, but how the public reacted to, say, the popularity of radio or television in other eras. I do think that you're absolutely right. Our principal thesis is that digital technology has become both a tool and a weapon. Our book is perhaps a little unusual because it talks as much or more about the weaponization of technology as it does about the benefits. To answer your question, are boards sufficiently focused on this? I think they're getting there. It is the nature of a board of directors, especially for a for-profit corporation, frankly, to focus a lot on the risks to the enterprise. So they have a natural governance orientation to ask questions about the various risks that are arising. I think the big challenge for any corporate board, especially in the world of technology, is just the complexity of the technology itself. And so my sense is that in many boardrooms, that's what people are trying to grapple with. They definitely understood that concerns around privacy, around cybersecurity attacks and the like are key board topics. And now they're trying to figure out how they cut through that complexity so that they can really get their arms around whether the enterprise itself is doing a sufficient job.
I mean, amongst the other changes that are taking place, we're also in a world of rapid geopolitical change, and particularly the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China. What are some of the challenges that you anticipate emerging from this, whether it, for supply chains or for regulation, for privacy, for competition? How do you think, this changing geopolitics will affect a business such as yours?
Well, we're definitely, I think, seeing the changing relationship between China and the United States, and perhaps China and some other countries, as one of the most significant geopolitical developments of this decade, and it is certainly impacting the technology sector. Yeah, I think we're seeing not a decoupling, but some drifting apart. We are definitely seeing an impact on hardware supply chains in terms of many companies moving part to, in some instances, perhaps almost all of their hardware manufacturing out of China and to other countries. That has been underway for the last, I would say, 18 months, even though it's not always discussed by companies publicly as much as it might. We're seeing that hardware manufacturing capacity shift to Vietnam, shift to South Korea, shift increasingly to other places in Southeast Asia, perhaps South Asia, perhaps Mexico. So I do think that this is something that, from a longer term perspective, creates potential new opportunities for, say, India, as well as others to make themselves more of a location for hardware manufacturing. I think when you get to the software side of technology, it too is having an impact, but life is more complicated, I would say. And I think that people in India are among the most familiar with the fact that in the world today, a software product is not created in a single location. There are lines of code that are written in different places, on different campuses, often in different countries, and then they're integrated together. Clearly, there are now, I think, more national security questions that are asked by some governments about where code comes from, what kind of review is taking place, what measures are there to protect the integrity of the code from tampering and the like. And I think what we're really focused on is, at some level, wanting to ensure that basic research can continue on a global basis, because the world's scientists and technology leaders often do their best work when they're talking about sort of the frontiers of scientific inquiry in a global way, and something like climate change obviously calls on that even more. We live in a world where a lot of source code is published in open source form, but we also live in a world where there is more scrutiny by many governments about the software development process.
One of the other issues that a lot of funding does seem to be directed towards is cybersecurity, which is a growing concern for governments around the world. What do you see as some of the challenges to addressing cybersecurity? Is it just about awareness amongst public and policymakers? Are people just complacent because they don't see the direct threats to data? Or is it the lack of technical and financial capabilities, or is it something else altogether?
Well, yeah, I do think, first of all, it's an extraordinarily important issue and problem that the world needs to address, and we in the tech sector need to address. And I think the recent spate of cybersecurity attacks underscore that even more clearly. I think the solution has to be multifaceted. I think it's always important for us at Microsoft to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, look, we have one of the first responsibilities in the world to protect cybersecurity. And so we have to ask ourselves, as we are, okay, how can we change our practices? How can we make our software and our services more secure? And what more can we do to help customers around the world? I think that one of the big conclusions from the recent attacks is, in my opinion, the world is more secure when it runs in the cloud than when it runs through on-premise servers. When it's in the cloud, we can see data, we can see attacks, we can upgrade constantly all of the software, we can upgrade the hardware. We have literally thousands and thousands of cybersecurity professionals. And for most enterprises, it's really not even conceivable or sensible to try to invest at that scale. And I think the more quickly we can move the world to the cloud, the better off we will be. Second, one of the things that we have found is that there are certain cybersecurity best practices that still are not being applied nearly as broadly as they should be. Whether it's patching of servers on premise, or the use of multi-factor authentication, or the security measures to tie down devices that people are using for their work. or the best practices, especially for, say, IT administrators, like least privilege access, meaning you don't give somebody access to an entire network if they don't need that for their job. There's just so many things that still are not being followed. And so then I think you have to ask yourself why and what can we do to change it. And the more we ask why, I think the more we come to two conclusions. One, we need to keep making this simpler, and we need to keep doing more to then get the word out. But the other is we just have a global shortage of cybersecurity professionals in the workforce. And I think we're going to need a global initiative to really accelerate the kinds of training to put more cybersecurity professionals in place. I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that as a tech company and with a company that has, say, LinkedIn. But I think this is going to be something that will be important for governments around the world to pursue as well. We've got to make it simpler, and we've got to get the right people into the workforce to make this a reality.
Your book makes a kind of unusual case, at least for a corporate leader, for more and better regulation. What kind of responsibility do you think big tech holds, and how can it do a better job, whether it's self-regulating or calling for better regulation when it comes to a number of things? But I think one of the topics that's on a lot of people's minds is online misinformation and disinformation.
Well, I do think our book makes an argument. And the argument we advance is that given the challenges, given the weaponization of technology, tech companies need to step up and do more. We need to adopt a higher level of self-responsibility, but governments need to move faster as well, because this has become so important to the world that we're not going to have a healthy market for the longer term without a degree of regulation. And I think if you just look at the history of technologies over time, what is surprising about digital technology is really that it has gone so many decades without being regulated. If you look at something like the telephone, or you look at electricity, or you look at television or radio or other things that impacted communications, all of them were regulated at an earlier stage, in their evolution. So I think the time has really come to advance both of these things. Certainly, misinformation and disinformation is one key area, and you're seeing more national deliberations now. I think first people are asking, what should the obligations be of tech companies that, say, have social media sites to remove unlawful content? That's one question. I think another is, what's the right balance for tech companies to take when they are removing content that may be lawful, but that they or others may find objectionable? How do you balance that with free expression and the like? And I think we're going to see more emergence of, in effect, a new model that probably will require tech companies to be more transparent in publishing the principles that they adopt, to follow them consistently, to give individuals who are impacted some right to appeal, and even perhaps having some regulatory review of whether companies are adhering to the principles they adopt. I also think that there are critical issues around disinformation campaigns being run by foreign governments. This is a new form of foreign attack. And I think this points to the other area where we've really tried to highlight the need for strong norms, and in some cases, some additional norms that will govern cyberspace, especially when it comes to something like cybersecurity. And when we look at something like, say, the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, this in many ways was led by the French government. Microsoft was an active proponent from the earliest stages. It has more than 1,000 signatories around the world. It has more than 75 governments, but not the governments of the United States or India. I'm hopeful that we'll see both governments, sign on to the Paris Call in the coming year. I'm hopeful that we'll see both governments and others really build on the conclusions that recently came out of the United Nations and its open-ended working group deliberations. I think we're at a moment in time where the world's democracies have a huge opportunity to pull together and really stand together for the kinds of norms that will protect freedom of expression and democracy and really address some of these cybersecurity attacks that I almost think are being waged on democracy itself.
Final question for you. If you were to, you were writing your book before COVID, the COVID pandemic, before the January 6th, developments on Capitol Hill. If you were to update your book now, what would you want to focus on more?
Well, it's an interesting question because by coincidence, we are coming out with a revised and updated edition, a 2021 edition that will come out in September. And so one of the things we did was we added 3 new chapters. One is about COVID and how that has changed the evolution of technology and how people will think about it, and which of the changes we've seen over the last couple of years, amidst COVID, are more likely to persist and which will be perhaps fleeting. We're focusing on the recent wave of cybersecurity attacks, so we have a new chapter on that. We have a new chapter on just a huge evolution of issues across Europe around digital sovereignty, issues that are very front and center before the Indian government as well. And as you would expect, and as we've discussed here, we've really written major changes and updates to our chapters on, say, the relationship between the U.S. and China, the issues around social media. One of the things that is just so striking about all of this is how quickly these issues continue to change. And so when I look back at what we wrote and published 2 years ago, we clearly had the right foundation. The table of contents is mostly right, but we're just seeing this continuing dialogue, and it's happening on a global basis. So we're seeing what is happening in India, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, and then across Europe, and then the United States and Canada, all more or less moving forward at the same time. And one of the things that has been so striking to me is that people in government are talking with each other more than ever. So they're watching each other, they're learning from each other. And I think within a country, one can often think that it's just about your own country. It's just about New Delhi. It's just about Washington, D.C. What is the legislative proposal of the moment? But what is really beneficial is to scan the planet, and then you see trends. And the more you see the trends, I think the more you're able to anticipate where things are likely to be going.
Well, thank you. Thanks for what was really a frank and wide-ranging conversation. It leaves it up to me to say thanks on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation America, and thank you for joining us. And for all viewers for joining us at Raisina at DC this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.